Before we go any further with exposure, I'd like to just try and give you an idea as to what the camera is trying to achieve when it's exposing the image. So cameras contain built-in exposure meters that measure the light hitting the camera's sensor from the photograph scene. And we need to set the ISO, the sensitivity of the sensor first, and then we can adjust the aperture and the shutter speed to affect the correct exposure. Now these are typical sort of exposure settings, an exposure setting dial on the camera. These two, P and intelligent auto settings, these types of settings tend to set everything automatically. And for the serious photographer, these probably aren't the best settings to use. They're great for snapshots and things like that, but they are totally automatic. We also have some custom modes here, which if you're into custom modes, you can maybe set them. But let's have a look at the main settings that most serious photographers use. We've got bulb, which is used for very long time exposures. So the idea of bulb is that you press the shutter and the shutter button, and it stays open. The shutter stays open for as long as you have it depressed. It's a totally manual setting. We have time value, the shutter priority. This is where you set the shutter speed and the aperture will automatically adjust to suit the lighting conditions. Now this is good if you wish to have a high shutter speed or a slow shutter speed, depending on the type of image that you're taking, and then you want the exposure to adjust automatically to compensate. Now AV, which is aperture priority, this is where you set the aperture and the shutter speed will then change automatically to suit the lighting conditions. These two are semi-automatic settings because you set one and the other setting, ignoring the ISO setting which you set originally, but for the TV it'd be the aperture changes, and for the AV it'd be the shutter speed changes automatically. Okay. And of course manual, we still have the manual setting, and this is where we've got to set everything. So we set the ISO, we can use the internal exposure meter in the camera to get an idea as to the exposure, but then we set the shutter speed and the aperture manually. And of course the exposure remains the same until you change any of those values. Some cameras, especially the more consumer orientated cameras, have loads of other settings like fully auto, landscape, sport, which tend to bias different aspects of the shutter speed and aperture depending on the type of subject that we're taking. Most serious photographers tend to ignore these sort of settings because you're not having control over the image. Also, although these are automatic settings, you do have the ability to override the setting, and here we can see that this has been compensated to 2/3 of a stop underexposing. So the camera will have determined an exposure it thinks is right, but based on the scene that you're looking in front of you, you think, well, actually it's going to screw this exposure setting up. It needs to be underexposed because it needs to be a darker image, so you underexpose. If it's like a snow scene where there's a predominance of snow all over the place, the camera will try and correct that brightness to what's called a grey, mid-grey tone. So in order to prevent that, you need to dial in either a stop or maybe even 2 stops of overexposure, so the resulting image comes out as intended. Although the cameras have got built-in exposure meters, one of the really best ways of determining exposure, especially if you're using manual exposure settings, is to use a handheld incident light meter. Now the camera contains a built-in exposure meter, but that depends on reflected light off the scene. So it looks at the scene in front of it and determines the amount of light reflected off it. Well, if it's a black wall or a white wall, that is going to totally screw up the exposure that the sensor, the exposure meter determines. If you have an incident light meter, the idea is you point the meter towards the scene, but the actual sensor is pointing away from the scene, and it picks up the light from the light source. So it's totally independent of the scene that it's being exposed for. It just relies purely on the lighting going onto the scene. So that's a really useful tool to have to get accurate exposures. So let's just have a quick look at how the camera sees and tries to get you a correct exposure. So a camera doesn't see it in colors like that. It sees it in shades of gray, the exposure meter. And it's programmed to correctly expose a gray of 18%. Now in the book I've gone into this in more detail. It's not exactly 18%, but for the purposes of this demonstration we'll say it's 18%, which is the usual average tonal density of an average scene. And of course we already know there's no such thing as an average scene, but we've got to start somewhere. So it tries to change the image from that into a neutral grey, 18% grey. However, the scene is not of an average tonality, then the camera will apply an incorrect exposure. And this little sequence of slides is what I'm trying to demonstrate here. It will assume that the image should be 18% grey and adjust the exposure accordingly. Now, this is an example of a colour confidence 18% grey card. So the idea is that if you're unsure as to what exposure to give the scene, you can actually take a reading off this card, this fold-up card, and set your exposure depending on what reading you get off that. And then you can confidently just point the camera at the scene and shoot away, okay, and get the right exposures. So what I did just to try and illustrate what the camera is trying to do, this is an 18% grey, neutral grey scene. I then created white, light grey, grey, 18%, and you can see that is the same as this, dark grey and black. What I then did was I pointed the camera, now this is taken off the computer screen, okay, and I pointed the camera at the white area here and did a spot meter off there, and I manually set the camera to expose for the white setting. Okay. Well, in the first time I did it with the neutral grey. Okay, so we'll do it with the neutral grey, and what happened is this is a picture of the screen, and the neutral grey appears to be the same. So it's actually done a reasonable job of exposing the whole screen to a neutral grey. It's given us a reasonable sort of exposure. Right, the next time, this is the computer screen, and I exposed for the white area. Okay, and so what happened is the resulting photograph that I took, there's the white, it changed the white to a neutral grey, and all the other greys, all the other shades became progressively darker and darker. So the camera decided that that white should be a neutral grey. I then photographed the black part of the screen. So I exposed for the black area there, and this is what the camera did. It changed the black to a neutral grey, an 18% grey. Okay, so this is just an example of how, unless you're aware of how the camera's exposure system works, you can start to get incorrect exposures if you leave it purely on the automatic setting. And this is where the bias, the exposure bias settings can come in handy, so that we don't get this sort of effect. So if you exposed, if it's a predominance of a dark background like this, you then dial in some underexposure to make sure that the black areas stay black even though it's an automatic exposure.